Hello and welcome back. What if God were to prove his existence? Would it make a difference? Would people behave any differently, or would they keep doing what they want to do anyway? In today's video, which covers 3 Nephi 1 and 2, we talk about that. But before we get into it, let me ask a trivia question, which we'll answer at the end. What did the Gadianton Robbers wear? They're becoming a very big and very real threat, but what did they wear? 600 years had passed since Lehi left Jerusalem. Nephi the prophet, who had worked so many miracles in the previous book, stepped down from his role as high priest, made his son responsible for the plates and other prophetic artifacts, and he departed from the land. We will read a few years later in chapter 2 that Nephi did not return to the land of Zarahemla and could nowhere be found in all the land. That observation implies that maybe he was expected to return after a few years. The timing of his disappearance is particularly intriguing. Why would he depart from the land in or just before the year of the Savior's birth? Did he hope to travel all the way to Jerusalem to witness him in person? Was he leaving town so he could be translated as Alma is rumored to have been? Or, as his critics might have said, did he simply not want to be around when the time of Samuel's prophecies arrived? In Zarahemla, despite an increase in signs and miracles, non-believers began to mock the believers, saying that the time for Samuel's sign had already passed. They rejoiced and celebrated and did make a great uproar throughout the land. But then they went a step further and declared that any believers in Samuel's teachings would be killed if the sign were not given by a designated day. Those brief details signal a few things about Nephite society. First, a government does not typically allow or sanction a mass killing unless they're part of it. Second, such a slaughter would only be possible if the non-believers outnumbered the believers by a huge margin. Lastly, the believers must have either been numbered on a list or have been easy to distinguish from the non-believers. Seeing the wickedness of his people, Nephi Jr., who had just inherited the prophetic mantle when his father departed, cried mightily to his God in behalf of his people, yea, those who were about to be destroyed because of their faith in the tradition of their fathers. After praying all day, the voice of the Lord came to him and told him not to fear. For on this night shall the sign be given, and on the morrow come I into the world. Even though the sign was eventually given, the scheduled execution of believers of the Son of God was a real threat, one that would have been carried out. But how is that even possible? How does a legal system not get involved in preventing an openly planned genocide? That didn't make any sense to me, so let's put the pieces together. As we discussed in the last video, Samuel, the Lamanites' audience, considered themselves to be good people, the type of people that would listen to a prophet. That's not to say that some people were not truly wicked. For example, the surrounding hills were occupied by Gadianton's band, who really were bad guys, and who made no effort to pretend that they were anything else. Also, these robbers seem to live an enviable lifestyle. In the last few verses of 3 Nephi 1, we find several Lamanite youths coming of age and being persuaded to join the robbers. I have to wonder what made a robber's life seem so appealing to young people. Later in the same chapter, in verse 24, it says that some people in Zarahemla began teaching incorrectly that it was no longer necessary to keep the law of Moses, with the Savior having been born. And that means that the people in Zarahemla were living and keeping the law of Moses, not just the Christians, but everyone. So, in my opinion, the planned execution of Christian believers was not a mob action, nor was it an example of a corrupt, lawless government. Instead, it's more likely that they were going to stone the believers for blasphemy under the law of Moses. For centuries, the religious leaders had tolerated this Christian faction and what it considered to be its blasphemous teachings. If Samuel's prophecy failed, there could be no arguing that they were anything other than a corrupt, misguided cult led by false prophets. The leaders had been as patient as they reasonably could be, but Samuel had drawn a line in the sand and promised that within 5 years there would be a night as bright as the noonday sun. After centuries of tolerating this Christian faction, they would finally have definitive, inarguable proof that its teachings were false. If Samuel's prophecy didn't happen, as much as they might hate to do it, the religious leaders would have no choice but to carry out the punishment for blasphemy prescribed by the law of Moses and stone the believers. My tone might make it seem like I'm being patient and understanding with the religious leaders who plan to murder the Christians, but I'm not. My intent is not to justify their actions, but instead to describe how they might have self-righteously justified their own actions to themselves. This is really not that different from the Sanhedrin in the New Testament righteously condemning and crucifying their own promised Messiah. The actions of both groups were abhorrent, and that they were done under the banner of righteousness makes them even more so. But the sign came, and when those who had planned the execution saw it, they fell to the earth as if they were dead, for they knew that the great plan of destruction had been frustrated. And this is more evidence that it was going to be a religiously justified execution. If their motivation had been to kill a group of people that they hated, they could still have easily done it. They still had numbers on their side. So my opinion is that the planned execution was tolerated not just by the government, but by the cities of Zarahemla, because they believed that it was a righteous judgment reluctantly carried out by long-suffering and patient leaders. But the sign proved Samuel's prophecy to be correct beyond any possible argument. It flipped the tables, and it suggested that Zarahemla's religious leaders, not the Christians, belonged to the misguided faction. Fortunately, the sign saved the believers, but unfortunately, as we'll see in the subsequent chapters, people don't like to change their opinions, regardless of what the evidence says. In verse 22, we learn that there were lines sent forth among the people by Satan to harden their hearts, that they might not believe in those signs and wonders which they had seen. It's one thing to question the theory of the existence of God's Son, a being born in a faraway land, and it's quite another thing to question a night without darkness that you witnessed with your own eyes and experienced along with everybody else in the land. If people began to disbelieve, which they did, the disbelief is the result of a hardened heart or a stubborn mindset rather than a lack of evidence. And if people are willing to disbelieve a sign like that, they're willing to disbelieve anything. The flip side of that argument is that believing in the Savior before the sign was given was also a question of mindset rather than evidence. Faith begins with a simple desire to believe or with a yearning for something to be true. So if we were to break the people into categories, we'd have people who had faith in God and chose to believe without seeing evidence. We have some people whose belief is only as strong as their memory of a miracle or of some spiritual experience. You have people who, even after evidence or a spiritual witness, are stubborn and don't want to change their minds. Which group of those, if any, do you fall into? But there's another group that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the Gadianton Robbers. They were living in the nearby hills. They would have been aware of the prophecy. They would have seen the wonders in the heavens, and they would have experienced the miraculous night without darkness, but they simply did not care. Even if God were proven to exist, they still didn't want to do what he said. They had their own agenda. Do you know people like that, where even if they knew that God was real, they'd still just keep doing what they wanted to do? Nephite descenders and some Lamanite youths who had also witnessed the miraculous sign chose to leave Zarahemla and join the band of robbers. In Helaman 15, Samuel the Lamanite had commended the Lamanites for their stalwart, unwavering belief. But with the Lamanite youths choosing to join Gadianton's band, Mormon observed that the Lamanite righteousness began to decline. And thus were the Lamanites afflicted also, and began to decrease as to their faith and righteousness because of the wickedness of the rising generation. Now we move to chapter 2. As the years passed, people began to be less impressed by the miraculous sign that they had seen of the Savior's birth. Many attributed it to a conspiracy or to the power of the devil. Dismissing the miracle allowed them to disbelieve the tradition of God's Son and think that the doctrine of Christ was a foolish and a vain thing. But even though they began to reason it away, it was still pretty indisputable. For example, they had changed their calendar to track time by counting the years since that sign was given. Years passed, with the people forgetting about the sign and becoming more wicked. By the 13th year, the Gadianton robbers had become a major problem. They did slay so many of the people and did lay waste so many cities and did spread so much death and carnage throughout the land that both the Nephites and Lamanites decided to unite together and fight against them. All the converted Lamanites united with the Nephites, and together this group took up arms against the Gadianton robbers, but so intense were the actions of the robbers that the Nephites were threatened with utter destruction. For some people seeking issue with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the next few verses are among the most controversial in the Book of Mormon. And it came to pass that those Lamanites who had united with the Nephites were numbered among the Nephites. And their curse was taken from them, and their skin became white like unto the Nephites. And their young men and their daughters became exceedingly fair. And they were numbered among the Nephites, and were called Nephites, and thus ended the 13th year. Some have suggested that the whitening of the skin was metaphorical, or an idiom, or a figure of speech. Some say that it was literal. In my opinion, we don't know enough to say for certain. I could add my own speculation to the mix, but even if I were to somehow solve that riddle, I'm not sure I'd know what to do with the information. Coming back to 3rd Nephi, the war between the robbers and the Nephites continued, and the Nephites forced their enemy to retreat. But the following year, the Gadianton robbers successfully countered, leaving the Nephites in great danger. And that's where we end today. We'll have to leave them in a cliffhanger, with the Gadianton robbers on the verge of destroying the Nephites, and the Nephites not knowing what to do. Speaking of the Gadianton robbers, let's answer that trivia question. What did they wear? We find this in 3rd Nephi chapter 4, verse 7. And it came to pass that they did come up to battle, and it was in the 6th month, and behold, great and terrible was the day they did come up to battle. And they were girded about after the manner of robbers, and they had a lambskin about their loins. And they were dyed in blood, and their heads were shorn, and they had head plates upon them, and great and terrible was the appearance of the armies of Gadianton because of their armor and because of their being dyed in blood. When they went to battle, the Gadianton robbers had shaved heads dyed in blood. But it sounds like lambskin loincloths might have been their regular apparel, where being girded after the manner of robbers meant wearing a lambskin loincloth. And maybe those loincloths were really stylish, which is why the young people wanted to go join them. Who knows? Comments are welcome. Subscribe if you haven't, and we will see you next time.